Hi everyone, thanks for giving us some time to talk about Refuge Gullies and how we're using Refuge Gullies to support improved land and stream management in South East Queensland. I'm Nat Parker.
And I'm Mark Ward.
So we've got a slide just showing the difference between peak flows in different kind of landscapes. And I guess the main takeaway is that when we have cattle and different agricultural practices, it makes the hydrograph, how quickly the water runs off the landscape, a lot more peaky with more volume, and so we get a lot of erosion. So what we're trying to do with landscape management is delay that hydrograph peak and reduce the volume so that we don't have so much erosion in the landscape.
So we have to ask ourselves, like, what do we do? How do we make this happen? So we know we need to retain maximum vegetation, particularly around those riparian areas. We can utilise large woody debris, so tree logs and logs with root balls on them. Buffer zones are really helpful. Having that strip of vegetation, whether it's native or exotic, to filter that water as it's coming into the creek system, will slow it down and filter out pollutants. And being really careful about how we plan our drainage systems throughout our properties. So we're being very conscious about how we get that water from in those hills or in the paddocks, on the flats, and into those waterways. And it's really simple, but we know we need to control those overland flows as close to the source as possible.
So how do we manage the energy? I guess one approach has been that we spend a lot of money in large creek systems and river systems to try and reduce that energy. These projects cost a lot of money, and it's very hard to get landholders along the journey when we're building these projects. So a couple of examples we've got on the slide is a pilefield project in the Worrell Creek in the Bremer catchment, and then a log jam project that was done in 2019 on the Bremer River. And so these projects, they're very exciting and very flashy. It's great to take funders there and show off what kind of works we've been doing, but they're very expensive projects. And I guess the question comes to us is, can we spend this money in different ways? And are we trying to, I guess, key into those principles that Mark talked about before around slowing the flow further up the catchment, closer to the source, so that we're not having to make these massive structures and design quite heavily engineered systems.
As the landscape shot is the next slide, you can see those really steep hills and the mountains in the background, the steep agricultural grazing land, and then those horticultural flats, and a small amount of riparian vegetation. It's a big old landscape. So we've been really conscious that moving higher in the landscape will be good for us. It'll be good for our dollars per tonne of sediment saved. We won't be working on those, really highly visible vertical bank faces in those rivers, but we know that there's a lot of sediment coming out of these gully systems. So the slide there is one of our team members, Corey, standing in a gully system. As you can see, huge amount of volume coming out of some of those gully systems. And the next slide is this real landscape shot that Nat took over. 500 meters there, Nat?
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah.
So we've got, I guess, it's a really beautiful demonstration of how the water moves through some bits of the landscape, and those options we have to intercept that water with leaky weirs, with vetiver hedges, and with dam systems, just to try and slow it down at key points throughout that landscape and really manage that flow and those velocities before it hits the river system.
Yeah, and the exciting thing with starting to target those paddock scale and gully scale things is we can bring landholders along the journey. You would have seen in that previous slide the fence line that was part of that project. So it was quite a big paddock that was fenced off and left and managed differently. And so over time, landholders can see the different grasses that come up, how soft the soil becomes after 4 or 5 years of having no cattle in there, and they start being able to think differently about how they manage the landscape. This one has a few leaky weirs in it, a rock shoot at the top, and it's been planted with trees at about a density of one every 8 to 10 metres, so that over the next 20 years it'll become a reasonably forested area, but it won't impact on grazing. So it'll have about 30% canopy cover at about 20 years, which means that it can still be grazed and utilised as a grazing area, but it's still a refuge for all sorts of other things.
So the next slide is a couple of years later, actually maybe even 3 years later, after those earthworks were completed. And again, it's that landscape shot, and right about in the centre of the frame, you can see the refuge gully being a slightly different colour. It's this rectangle in the landscape that suddenly was acting very differently to the grazed paddock alongside it. This is a more zoomed in shot after quite a large event that moved through that entire system. So in the top right hand corner of the frame, you can see the Bremer River. That little tree line is the Bremer River, and you can see this gully system being that different colour right through the middle of the frame there. And the reason why it looks a bit different is not only were the grasses really dense and quite tall through there, but also it's had this very large water flow move through it. So you can see where that water is sort of concentrated through that flow, and you can see in the bottom left-hand part of the frame the strip of vetiver grass that was one of the structures we've used to sort of distribute that water throughout through the refuge gully to slow it down, drop that sediment, and really sort of rehydrate that landscape.
And what looks maybe like erosion is actually very thick dead grass that's lying through the refuge gully. It is probably half a foot to a foot thick.
Yeah, and it was a great demonstration for us on the advantages of vetiver grass over the endemic grasses through this bit of the landscape. We've got some great native options that just that can form really dense stands and have great root systems. That grass that's lying down is blady grass, which is, in my opinion, one of our best grasses for holding our bits of the landscape together. But in those big events, it just lays down flat, and that's just how it grows. Whereas the vetiver grass, you can see, will stay erect or largely erect through those events and really slow that water flow down. We've got low-cost solutions that they can come and look at. They can kick the rocks, kick the dirt, and go, yeah, actually I can build this on my place. And we talk through some of the fundamentals, the things they need to watch out for, and it's really just empowering them and giving them the tools to go away and do these on their own properties.
The other really cool thing about refuge gullies is they actually provide multiple and ever improving NRM outcomes, such as native habitat, denser and more diverse pastures for stock. And that pasture then gets eaten by the stock and carried over the rest of the property, which might be degraded. And one of the things that really encouraged us along this path was we did a bit of a study looking at comparing some of the earthworks that we do in streams to some of the revegetation programs that we've done. And if you look at it as a holistic NRM outcome, it's far better in 20 or 30 years to have vegetation in the landscape that's providing all these other benefits as well as erosion control. So here's some examples of what you might do with a refuge gully. Some small dams or leaky weirs you can see on the left of your screen, and then the bypass, which is on the right of your screen, which needs to be designed carefully so that it doesn't become the gully itself. So it has to have a certain width and slope, and vetiver protection, which you can just see in the image, so that those flows don't start eroding the bypass. Here's some rock tubes examples of a refuge gully just downstream of a dam, and then earthen leaky weir in the right hand picture, which you can see just after it was completed, with rock for the PVC pipes that come through, and then the bypass area through the centre there. Here's some more examples of some of the tools, which obviously chain of ponds many of you would have heard of. We're very big advocates of that. It's really a refuge gully focused on doing a chain of ponds, but again, at getting that vegetation and those hedges in the right locations has a huge impact on the hydraulics and hydrology of that landscape.
These vetiver hedges we've found extremely useful for slowing water flow in a whole range of situations, but in refuge gullies they're a nice, easy green infrastructure thing that gets better over time and at very low cost. So we plant these vetiver plants 25 centimetres apart. I'm putting my hand up because it's a handspan for us. It's critical that these sites are fenced off for several years, and in South East Queensland that's about 4 to 6 years while that vegetation really gets going. We want those trees above the head of cattle. We know that's what we need before stock go in there, otherwise it will get seriously damaged. When we're putting canopy in there, it's tempting from an environmental perspective to pack as many trees into a landscape that you're working in as possible, but it does cost a lot of money, and we're also very conscious that the multiple benefits of refuge gullies mean that we want that grass cover in there. We need that ground cover to prevent future erosion as well. Management of these sites is very tricky. So landholders go from cows, stock managing all to being a site where cows don't touch for 4 years. So we've been very conscious that we have to have the labour force to get in there and look after those weeds. So the farmer sees it as a grass asset and as an environmental asset rather than just a big festy weed pit.
So refuge gullies are a key tool supporting erosion and stream management. They facilitate landholder engagement, which we're really excited about, and improve land management potentially over the whole property. The refuge gullies target degraded gullies. They stabilise the eroding areas with engineering, small scale earthworks and revegetation. So we're just advocating integrating these refuge gullies into people's thinking, and also working with landholders to evolve the grazing management practices that happen on the broader landscape. We can see improved pasture cover and composition, and it results in greater soil infiltration rates in these areas, reduced overland flow velocities, and increased profitability for landholders. So get out there and advocate for refuge gullies.